I didn't say a word when the HOA president screamed about my illegal structure and waved that ridiculous $30,000 fine in my face. I just reached into my briefcase, pulled out the original 1887 territorial deed, placed it gently on the conference table. The room went silent. Their lawyer, who had been smirking just seconds before, suddenly looked like he'd seen a ghost. I watched the color drain from his face as he read the header, Territorial Grant of Mountain Ridge Access Road and Adjacent Mineral Rights. Then I leaned back in my chair and said the words I'd been rehearsing for 6 months. Gentlemen, you've been assessing fines on property outside your jurisdiction? But more importantly, you've been using my road without permission for the past 15 years. The whole mess started 3 years ago when I inherited my grandfather's cabin up on Timber Ridge. I wasn't looking for trouble. Hell, I wasn't looking for much of anything except a place to disappear on weekends and maybe retire to someday. The cabin sat on 47 acres of pine and aspen. It's about 8 miles up a winding dirt road from the nearest paved street. It was primitive in the best way possible. No cell service, no internet, just a wood stove, a hand pump well, and windows that looked out over 3 counties. My grandfather had built it in 1962 with lumber he'd milled himself, and it had that solid, unpretentious feel that modern construction never quite manages. I'd spend Saturday mornings fixing whatever had broken over the week, afternoons fishing the creek that ran along the back of the property, and evenings reading by lamplight. It was the kind of simple life that makes you wonder why anyone chooses to live any other way. The Timber Ridge Homeowners Association controlled the development of about 200 houses that had been built in the valley below my property sometime in the 1990s. Nice enough places, I suppose. Though they all looked identical with their beige siding and manicured lawns, I had nothing against the people who lived there. Most of them seemed like decent folks trying to raise families and build equity like everyone else. But their HOA board was a different story entirely. They operated like a small-town dictatorship, complete with a president who drove around in a golf cart taking photos of violations, and a secretary who sent threatening letters about grass height and mailbox colors. I'd heard stories from people in town about their heavy-handed enforcement, but I figured it wasn't my problem. My cabin was miles up the mountain, completely separate from their little suburban kingdom. I was wrong about that. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday in October. It was addressed to property owner, 4847 Timber Ridge Road, and informed me that I was in violation of HOA Covenant Section 12.3.7 for unpermitted structural modifications and owed an immediate fine of $500. I read it twice, then checked the address on my property deed. My cabin was located on Old Mining Trail, not Timber Ridge Road. I called the HOA office and spoke to a woman named Patricia, who insisted their records showed my property was part of the development. When I explained that my cabin was 8 miles up the mountain and had been built 30 years before their subdivision existed, she became dismissive and told me I could dispute the fine at the next board meeting. I figured it was a simple mistake, some kind of a dressing error that would be cleared up once I showed them my deed and survey. I was naive enough to think reasonable people would admit their error and apologize. I showed up to their November board meeting with my deed survey and a county tax assessment that clearly showed my property was outside their jurisdiction. The meeting was held in the community center, a bland building that looked like every other suburban amenity building in America. About 30 residents were scattered across folding chairs, most of them there to complain about snow removal or discuss holiday decorations. The board sat at a card table in front, led by a woman named Helen Morrison, who introduced herself as the HOA president. She had that particular brand of aggressive politeness that comes from years of wielding small amounts of power over unwilling subjects. When my turn came to speak, I presented my documents and explained the situation clearly and calmly. I thought it would be over in 5 minutes. Instead, Helen barely glanced at my paperwork before informing me that their association had expanded jurisdiction to include all properties accessing the area via Timber Ridge Road. She claimed my cabin was grandfathered into their covenants due to shared infrastructure usage and upheld the fine. When I pointed out that my access road was completely separate and predated their development by decades, she gavelled me down and moved to the next agenda item. That night, I went home and read their covenants cover to cover. It was 27 pages of dense legalese covering everything from fence heights to flower bed maintenance. But nowhere did it mention expanded jurisdiction or grandfathering rights for external properties. I researched Colorado HOA law and confirmed what I already suspected. Homeowners associations cannot unilaterally expand their authority to include properties that were never part of the original development. I drafted a formal response citing the relevant statutes and demanding they withdraw the fine. Their lawyer responded 2 weeks later with a form letter stating that I had 30 days to pay or face legal action. The fine had also mysteriously increased to $1,200 due to administrative costs and continued violation. I was starting to understand that these people weren't interested in being reasonable. Over the next 6 months, the harassment escalated in ways that would have been comical if it weren't so expensive and stressful. They sent monthly fine notices, each one larger than the last, claiming violations for everything from unauthorized gravel placement to non-compliant vegetation management. They photographed my property from the road and sent certified letters demanding I remove a storage shed that my grandfather had built in 1965. In March, they placed a lien on my property for $8,700 in accumulated fines and fees. My wife started having anxiety attacks every time we saw their official envelopes in our mailbox. Our teenage daughter asked if we were going to lose the cabin, the place where she'd learned to fish and camp and appreciate silence. I realized this wasn't just about money anymore. These people were trying to destroy something my family treasured. They were using legal intimidation to do it. That's when I stopped trying to reason with them and started playing their game. I drove up to the county courthouse and requested every piece of documentation related to my property going back to its original territorial grant. What I found changed everything. My land wasn't just outside their jurisdiction, it controlled something they desperately needed. The deed showed that my property included not only the cabin and 47 acres, but also something called Mountain Ridge Access Road and associated right-of-way easements. I spent 3 days in the county surveyor's office, cross-referencing maps and legal descriptions, before I understood what I was looking at. The road that every single resident of Timber Ridge Estates used to access their development, the road they called Timber Ridge Road, was actually the same Mountain Ridge Access Road that was deeded to my property in 1887. The HOA development had been built assuming they had permanent access rights, but those rights had never been formally transferred or purchased. For 15 years, 200 families had been driving across my land twice a day without permission. I spent the next month consulting with 3 different property attorneys to make sure I understood the implications correctly. The law was clear. The original territorial deed granted my family exclusive control over the access road. No subsequent property transfers had modified that arrangement. The development's builder had apparently assumed the road was public infrastructure, but it had never been deeded to the county or state. The HOA's own legal documents referenced Timber Ridge Road as if it were a public right-of-way, but that was simply an error that had been perpetuated for years. I owned the road. I owned the bridge that crossed Pine Creek. I owned the gravel turnaround where the school bus picked up kids every morning. More importantly, I owned the legal right to control access to their entire community. Armed with this knowledge, I developed a strategy that was perfectly legal and absolutely devastating. First, I formally notified the county that I was asserting my property rights over Mountain Ridge Access Road and requested they update their records to reflect private ownership. Then I sent a certified letter to every property owner in Timber Ridge Estates informing them that they had been trespassing on my private road for 15 years, but that I was willing to negotiate reasonable access agreements. I sent a separate letter to the HOA board offering to grant them a permanent easement for $50,000. Exactly what I calculated they'd spent on legal fees trying to find me over the past year. The response was immediate and predictable. Helen Morrison called my lawyer screaming about extortion and harassment. Their attorney sent a letter threatening to sue me for frivolous claims and intentional interference with property rights. They clearly thought I was bluffing. 2 weeks later, I installed a gate at the bottom of Mountain Ridge Access Road with a sign that read private property, no trespassing, access by appointment only. I posted my phone number and offered to grant temporary access to residents. Who called ahead? But I made it clear that all access was now by permission only. The gate was beautiful solid steel with an electronic lock system that I could control remotely. I added security cameras to document any attempts to circumvent the gate, and I hired a local ranch hand to monitor the property during weekdays when I couldn't be there myself. Within 3 days, my phone was ringing constantly with panicked residents who suddenly couldn't get to their homes without my permission. The school district called to ask about bus access. The fire department wanted to know about emergency vehicle passage. The Postal Service suspended mail delivery to the entire development because they couldn't guarantee access. I was polite to everyone who called. I explained that I was simply asserting my legal property rights and that I was happy to work out reasonable access arrangements with individual property owners. The HOA board, meanwhile, was in complete chaos. They held an emergency meeting and voted to pay for a legal survey of the access road. But their own surveyor confirmed what I already knew. The road was private property that had never been formally transferred to public use. They consulted with 3 different law firms, all of whom apparently delivered the same devastating news. Their development had been built on the assumption of permanent road access that didn't legally exist. Property values throughout the community began dropping as word spread that access could be revoked at any time. Real estate agents started advising potential buyers to avoid the area due to ongoing access disputes. Several families put their houses on the market. Unwilling to live with the uncertainty of potentially being landlocked, the turning point came in August. Almost exactly 1 year after I'd received that first ridiculous fine notice, Helen Morrison called and asked for a private meeting, just the 2 of us. We met at a coffee shop in town, and for the first time since this whole thing started, she wasn't angry or threatening. She was scared. She explained that her own attorney had advised her that the HOA was facing potential lawsuits from every property owner in the development. If they couldn't secure permanent road access, the insurance company was threatening to cancel coverage. The county was considering removing Timber Ridge from official maps since it was technically a private development with no public access. She asked what it would take for me to grant them a permanent easement. I told her the truth. They could have had one for free if they'd withdrawn that first fine and apologized. Now it would cost them exactly $30,000. $1 for every dollar they'd tried to steal from me in fraudulent fines. 3 weeks later, I sat in a conference room downtown and signed an easement agreement that granted Timber Ridge Estates permanent road access in exchange for $30,000 and a written acknowledgement that my property had never been subject to their jurisdiction. Helen Morrison signed it without making eye contact. Their lawyer looked like he was attending a funeral. The check cleared 2 days later, and I used the money to build a new deck on my cabin and install solar panels that make me completely energy independent. The HOA dissolved their enforcement committee and hired a new management company that actually understands property law. They still send me a holiday card every December, which I find oddly touching. These days I drive up to my cabin every Friday afternoon and don't think about homeowners associations or legal battles or fine notices. I fish the creek, maintain the trails, and watch the seasons change from my deck. The road is quiet against the way it should be. The families in Timber Ridge Estates go about their lives without interference, and I go about mine. Sometimes I see Helen Morrison at the grocery store in town, and we nod politely at each other like civilized people. I think she learned something about the difference between authority and power. Just like I learned something about the importance of reading the fine print. The only difference is that now, when I read property deeds and survey maps, it's because I want to, not because I have to. And that makes all the difference in the world.